Great Horn Email Security protects organizations from advanced threats such as impersonations, credential theft, and zero-day attacks. With Great Horn, you will detect and block more phishing threats from reaching users, reduce risk by providing employees with in-the-moment education, and quickly remove dangerous emails from inboxes in just 2 clicks. Great Horn protects your organization before, during, and after an email attack. Schedule a demo by visiting securityweekly.com/greathorn. When it comes to modernizing identity, Active Directory just makes everything harder, from managing access for contractors and departing employees to securing cloud apps and on-prem systems. Your company deserves better. Choose Okta, the modern identity platform that securely connects anyone that touches your organization to any technology they want to use. Okta reduces AD vulnerabilities, secures not only employees but contractors and customers, simplifies domain consolidation, and reduces your attack surface. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/Okta. Security can't solve crucial problems when they have to wade through thousands of alerts a day. With ServiceNow, you can easily prioritize and respond to your most crucial business threats. That way you can go from overwhelmed to under control. ServiceNow brings security, risk, and IT together on one platform. Learn more at securityweekly.com/ServiceNow. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. Quick announcement: attend the RSA Conference 2020, February 24th through the 28th. I do that all the time. And join thousands of security professionals, forward-thinking innovators, and solutions providers for 5 days of actionable learning, inspiring conversation, and breakthrough ideas. Register before January 24th and save $900. Save an extra $150 by going to securityweekly.com/RSAC 2020. We will be in Broadcast Alley for 4 days, so if you work for a security vendor and would like to do a micro interview with us, you can go to the same page, securityweekly.com/RSAC 2020. Matt, I will turn it over to you to introduce our guests, as you were kind enough to pull together this segment and interview at last minute, short notice.
Yes,
so thank you to our guests.
Yes, and I'm excited to bring the Kenna Security guys on. Jason Rolleston is the Chief Product Officer with Kenna Security. Came over from McAfee, I believe, right, Jason?
That's right.
Awesome. And then also we have Michael Roytman on the Chief Data Science side. Michael's done a lot of presentations around the work that they've been doing from a vulnerability analytics perspective. We're going to get into some of the things that Kenna does on, how do they prioritize vulnerabilities from a risk-based perspective. Michael's been instrumental in building a lot of that capability at Kenna Security as well. So, gentlemen, thank you and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I think this problem certainly still very much a problem today, and a problem that we've heard about. 3 of us collectively have worked for vulnerability management vendors in the past, and I think if there's one theme we heard from everyone who was working to achieve some level of vulnerability management program, everyone struggles with the problem: how do I prioritize all of these vulnerabilities? And that is still very much a problem today, and still something people very much struggle with. So we're glad to have you folks on the show to give us a little insights into your solutions and approaches to this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely a big problem for us. We see it across a lot of customers really struggling with that prioritization question and struggling with how to make the vulnerability management program efficient and effective. I think what you have is you have 2 different sides of the puzzle here. You have the IT teams who are fully committed and incented and focused on managing IT risk and availability and uptime. And then you have security teams who are very much focused on security risk and exposure. And they're really across purposes, right? So we get this huge list of vulnerabilities, try to patch those into security in many ways, trying to patch as many things as they can to reduce risk. As we know, on the IT side of the house, every single patch you introduce has the potential to cause outage or downtime, and it just creates a ton of friction and pain across that interface. I think it's probably one of the biggest sources of pain between those two groups in an organization. So this is a long-running process, a long-running problem for many companies. And as you say, most people have been looking at prioritization from a context of the vulnerability itself. If you think of CVSS and many of the scores, they talk about what is the potential risk of this vulnerability, the seriousness of the vulnerability, how prevalent is that software, things like that. And I think where Kenna really took a different approach, and Michael will talk to it, is by focusing much more on attacker behavior, really focusing on what's happening out in the world and which of these vulnerabilities are actually being exploited. Which of these have we seen published exploits? Where have we seen attacks? Where do we see malware? Where do we see exploit kits? And by kind of focusing the attention on what hackers are doing, we find that there's a much smaller percentage, something between 2 and 5% of all vulnerabilities that are out there that have been discovered, that you really need to worry about because they're being actively attacked. And then there's kind of a larger, maybe it's 20% of things that we think could be attacked sometime soon. What that allows you to do is be really focused on what you execute on, to not chase the 80% there, the 80 to 90% of vulnerabilities that aren't being attacked, and therefore by patching them, you're not really reducing risk. Done correctly, what this allows you to do is kind of reduce the overall patch workload, and therefore reduce the amount of risk IT is taking on, while actually achieving superior outcomes on the security side of the house. It's really this kind of magic win-win if you get this right, where security is doing less work, IT is doing less work, yet you're both achieving a superior outcome against reducing IT risk and reducing security risk, and you just remove a ton of friction from that relationship.
Now,
and that's really what Kenna's in many ways all about. And there's a lot of magic behind the scenes as to what goes into it, and could talk about a number of different angles. But the heart of it, the heart of that challenge is making that process more efficient and effective, and yielding superior outcomes for both of those constituents.
Yeah, and what we've started to see, Jason, now is the vulnerability management vendors trying to do aspects of this themselves. But I think they have some limitations in what they can do overall. And I see two basic limitations. I'd like your take on this and how Kenna Security kind of addresses this. The first one is they only see the vulnerabilities that they can scan for. Vulnerability sources are plenty. There is not one single scanner in the world that's going to get all your vulnerabilities, because we see vulnerabilities at the application layer. We see vulnerabilities at different pieces. So I think that's one limitation the VMs have. The second one is, even though they might have some exploit data, threat intelligence data to come in, they still don't understand business context, which I think is the other big missing factor in this risk discussion that the VMs might try to do, but I haven't seen them effectively do it in really understanding what is the criticality of the asset and the data that those assets have. Can you talk to those 2 points?
Yeah, 100%. I'll start with the first one. Absolutely. We see tremendous diversity in vulnerability sources, and it's only getting more diverse and going forward. You guys have been paying attention recently, you'll see the entry of Microsoft, of CrowdStrike, Tanium, a number of the endpoint vendors saying, look, I've already got endpoint technology out there. Why am I not doing vulnerability enumeration, right? So we're seeing for a number of endpoints, customers are coming to us saying, hey, we're going to use CrowdStrike to do this. We're going to use Tanium to do this, in addition to whatever scanner we're using for network devices and network assets. Your points on application are correct. Container security, all of a sudden, I'm not necessarily going to Rapid7 for that, or Qualys, or Tenable. I'm going to Twistlock. I'm going to Aqua. I'm looking at whatever I'm using for native container security to source those vulnerabilities. So kind of, we've always been multi-vendor, multi-source. Right? Our view is collect the vulnerability data from wherever it came from, and provide that holistic view. And even in the scanner world, companies acquire other companies, and you don't always have full coverage of a single scanner, right? So I think that multi-vendor, broad-based view, integrate, get the vulnerability data from wherever it is, kind of approach has benefited us tremendously. And I agree, I think it's something that the scanners have struggled with. I mean, it's tough. It's always tough to go build those integrations and work with your most fierce competitors. But I think that's what's required, in the vulnerability field going forward, is that kind of openness and that type of a multi-vendor approach. I think your second point is great as well, this kind of concept of how you're starting to bring in additional context in and around, and it kind of builds on that first thought, that you've got to be very open to getting data from a lot of places. That business context isn't just found in one place. I mean, even a CMDB is not always up to date. As you get into application security, it's more nuanced, what's important, what isn't. And so you've got to have a way to bring that data in and help inform the decisions, help bring that context to make certain vulnerabilities that are high severity, maybe lower importance because they're in a test environment that's protected or in some internal part of the network. But to do that, you've got to be able to get that information in, and you got to have an approach and a technology stack that allows you to bring all that data to bear. And again, I think the partnership and kind of ecosystem hasn't really been the way that those vendors have been focused in the past for sure.
Right. So
Sorry,
now,
Michael, did you have comments on that?
Yeah, I think this is a fundamental mismatch in signal to noise incentives. The VM vendors have a lot of incentive to create more vulnerabilities and to create signatures for those vulnerabilities, which is all good and useful to security. But to the IT ops folks, as Jason was saying, and to the security folks attempting to cut down on that noise, the incentive is different. The incentive is finding ways to slice out the irrelevant. And so we've been doing this for about 20 years, where more and more data is being created by signature writing scanners, by things like CrowdStrike and Tanium that generate agent-based signatures and then can get converted to vulnerabilities. And now we're in the stage where we want to invert that pyramid and shift to looking to what is truly a risk, as Matt was saying, based on asset context, based on what attackers are doing, whatever information we have that is relevant to addressing the risk itself, and then pivot out into which of the many vendors that we have today can we use to find that in our environments.
And Michael, I love what you said, and having worked in vulnerability management, right? The goal is, from the scanning perspective, find as many vulnerabilities and conditions and data, find as much as you can, and then let someone else sort it out. But what customers really want is go find all the problems and then tell me what's most important, right? Mm-hmm. Save me that work of trying to do that, and that's really a somewhat different way of looking at it.
Well, and to rephrase Matt's second question, in terms of a business context and in terms of what customers contribute to what they feel is risk, to what degree do you give your customers the ability to rank or score what they determine to be high, medium, or low risk?
So I think the main inclusion for us is working with the customer to understand the priority of the various assets themselves, the priority of the applications, and that can come from a variety of sources. It can be, the compliance. It could be where it sits in the network. It could be the kind of data that exists on the asset, whatever it is. So you're really focused on helping them understand the prioritization of the various assets. We really focus our work on the back end on the vulnerability severity, the chance that vulnerability will be exploited, right? The chance that you're going to get hit on that vuln based on what we know is happening in the world, what we know exists in malware, what we know is actually going on. And so for the back end for us, we're really doing that math, that science, and Michael can give you the details on that. The interface of the customers is a lot more to do with how they kind of bring in their context from the environment. They'll prioritize which assets are more important than others.
So if I can use the term customization, and I don't know if that's a term that is part of your vernacular, I mean, to what degree do your customers have the ability to customize, or do they give you ideas and you have to build it for them? I'll
tell you this, on the likelihood side, very little. So we give the ability to change the likelihood scores for vulnerabilities, but across almost 500 customers, we don't see anybody doing it. And I equate that to a weather forecast scenario. The probability that a hurricane hits a town is more or less the same, given where you are in the city. But the work that security people have to do is to figure out exactly which assets are structurally unsafe or can't take that risk or might have mitigating controls in place. And all of that is the asset criticality piece, where we rely almost exclusively on our customers for finding it. Maybe we know if it's internal or external. Maybe we know which applications are running on which infrastructure. But certainly, I separate it in terms of likelihood is something we use global sensor networks, threat intelligence data, the metadata that we OEM or have partnerships with to get, and then build data science machine learning models to predict or describe. The infrastructure itself is something that is entirely in the eyes of the IT ops and security folks, and they know more about it than any outside-in scanner or tool can know.
Yeah, and now, Michael, to that point, are customers able to define other areas of their infrastructure? And the two things that come to mind are the, I guess, level of exposure. Like, is it an internet-facing system, or is it 3 levels deep, within my network? And then can they also describe some level of compensating controls? I've got some type of network protection. I've got endpoint security on it. I've got something else that is going to mitigate that vulnerability in lieu of a patch.
That's right. And I see that in 2 ways. One way that people customize it is to say this group of assets is behind this, or I think that this is a less important cluster of infrastructure because it's a test environment. That is a segmentation that we allow folks to do with Elasticsearch safe searches. We call them risk meters, but essentially they're dynamic criteria that people set up as groups, and that's what they monitor over time. And then you can go deeper and say, on this asset, this particular vulnerability is an accepted risk because I know I have Carbon Black running at the latest version, and that CV is mitigated. Or I've already applied a mitigating control, so I don't need to fix that SQLi, even though there's a whole bunch of other vulnerabilities on that asset. So there's a global segmentation that happens that segments according to risk, and then we allow people to set the priorities of those groups of assets. But then, just like in any organization, there's folks working within that group that also have knowledge that no scanner will pick up, that no CMDB will pick up, and then they input into Kenna, and then we process that into overall risk or recommendations for action. And
what I love about that is typically that's been a conversation between IT and security about every single vulnerability, right? Threat modeling every single vulnerability. Essentially what you've done at Kenna is allowed the software to threat model those vulnerabilities to give the teams proper prioritization on a continuous basis.
That's right.
Yeah,
and I think 100%. That is, we know what the software can do and what the software can't do. So those conversations are still happening on site at the clients. It's just that there's a source of truth where they're getting it.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I've understood what you're saying because I'm intrigued by it. You're solving this problem by giving the customer the ability to segment or group their assets. You're not giving them different results. They're sorting their results based on what the targets were that you have assessed. Is that an accurate regurgitation of what you said?
I'd say slightly differently than that.
Okay,
we
please.
take in all of the security data at first. So what we're describing is all of your scan data from VM to application security coming from Rapid7, Tenable, Qualys, OS Query, Tanium, wherever it's coming from. We deduplicate that and correlate that to assets. And then the segmentation happens when they put in their business logic. For example, some folks might have a Linux remediation group and a Windows remediation group, but others might not think in terms of technology. They might think in terms of business process and have a US East and a US West remediation group. Or they might have something that's all the way down to layer 7 related to application, and they'll have the dynamic static scans and the underlying infrastructure there. So whatever the process is that's doing the remediation can be modeled in terms of looking for the groups of assets and vulnerabilities, combining them, and then whatever group you give us, we will do reporting on that, give you recommendations of best actions, and compare that to the other groups, which is vital in that segmentation of this is higher risk, this is lower risk. So they're doing it almost by describing their workflow, and the metadata of that workflow is what tells us the grouping and segmentation.
Gotcha.
And it's that metadata of those groupings that tie into your math models on the back end when you're doing the analysis to actually figure out which vulnerability should be a higher priority, right? I mean, that's part of the model along with the vulnerability severity itself and other threat intelligence data.
So here's a good example of that. If you tell me I've got a Windows 10 group and a Windows 7 group, but the Windows 10 group has a asset priority of 2 across the board, then almost no vulnerability on that, even if we think the likelihood is really high, we would able to tell you to remediate above the Windows 7 group. So the likelihood is something that is global, and we will determine likelihood based on all of the outcome measures, and I'm sure we'll get into that too, which is what is the probability that this thing will be successfully exploited? Have we seen that successful exploitation before? What is the volume and velocity? But then what you remediate is contextualized based on those assets, that grouping, and that metadata of your workflow, or what we recommend you remediate.
For giggles, since you mentioned a Windows 7 group, what are you going to advise your customers come February?
So that's going to depend entirely on what they prioritize the assets with. But if you just look at vulnerabilities themselves, it's going to be a real time, every half an hour will update. And if there's successful exploitation, those vulns are going to speed back up and jump to the top.
It is kind of an interesting conversation.
Likelihood is essentially, sorry, Jason, you can jump in too for a sec. But the stochastic nature of that likelihood is really why we rely so much on global likelihood measures, because data is coming in real time. Typically, at a scanner, they'll give that vulnerability a priority. 2 months later, it might change. There might be some reassessment. For us, it's an ETL pipeline of likelihood, which makes it much easier to rely on it as the prioritization.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I was going to say it's for the end of life operating systems, it's kind of interesting because that doesn't necessarily move our severity, right? To Michael's point, the likelihood that you're going to get hit on a given vulnerability doesn't change because you're EOL or not. What changes is remediation, right? So an EOL type issue, it's this: you might not have a patch, right? The patch isn't there, and so you're going to have to look at something like a compensating control. And the challenge with compensating controls is they don't really map to vulnerabilities. It's actually quite difficult to get an IPS, a WAF, something like that to say, can you block this specific vulnerability or an attack on this specific vulnerability? But I think that's where the challenge of the EOL comes in. Is not so much that the risk is somehow different inherently, it's that you don't have a great way to remediate, right? So your challenge is more about how do you achieve your SLA, how do you achieve your response to risk in an EOL environment when kind of patching has been removed as an option.
Right. Here's my 2020 prediction. I think a lot of folks will increase the asset criticality on assets running Windows 7. That doesn't mean that the vulnerabilities are more or less likely to get exploited, but our customers will recognize that they can't remediate those because there might not be a patch around. So they'll increase the severity on those to force the business to act on replacing those systems.
Got it. So I want to get into some of the analytics work and some of the work you've done on predictive analytics to say, when we see a vulnerability, what's the likelihood or the probability that it's going to be exploitable? You guys have done some really interesting research on this front that I think ties into your models, which I think are pretty unique in the industry right now.
I am more than happy to talk about this litany. I think the word predictive is often misused in security. When something has an exploit, that variable about the vulnerability is predictive of it being exploited. But that's not the same thing as to say that vulnerability is exploited. For example, about 22% of vulnerabilities have proof of concept exploit code and exploit DB or Metasploit, but only about 2 to 5% of those ever get used in successful compromise. So the challenge of filtering the signal from the noise in security is to say, a vulnerability just came out. We know very little about it except maybe the CVSS score in the description. Is anybody going to write an exploit for it? And then the next step is to say, an exploit may have been written or may not have been written. Do we think that there will be a successful exploitation of that? And if you really think about what we're describing there, it's attacker behavior. Is there an incentive for somebody to write an exploit about this vulnerability? Will it pay, literally pay most of the time, for them to invest the time to write that exploit? And then is that exploit likely to be effective? Is it something that will be used as a targeted attack or a non-targeted attack sprayed across the internet? And so we have a couple of models that we use to do this, and we lean heavily on Jay Jacobs and Wade Baker from the Cienti Institute to help us with that modeling and validation. But whenever a vulnerability comes out, we grab all of the text-based data about that vulnerability. So that could be the NVD description, the IBM X-Force description, any of a number of threat vendors. But then we also look at all of the reference links, whether that's a Twitter post or a blog post or a vendor advisory, grab all that text data and do NLP mining on that to find about 250 variables about the vulnerability. We look at all the products and vendors that were affected by it. We look at all of the available public exploit data and some of that dark web exploit data. And then we look at whether or not the software that it's on is trending, whether it's something that we often see Tenable scan in or often see Qualys scan in, because if you think about our original data set, we've got a whole bunch of existing scan data already. So all of that is about 3,500 variables, and we build two models. The first is the vulnerability just came out. What's the probability that an exploit will be developed for it? And that's something that we continuously update. So at the moment it's released, for some vulnerabilities, like for Bluekeep, for example, we'll say there's a 95% chance that somebody's going to write an exploit for this vulnerability. Remediate it today, even though the exploit doesn't exist yet. And then the next step is the score, the likelihood score that we're really modeling in the platform for prioritization, is to say, we might know nothing about this vulnerability, or we might have rich, robust data over the past 10 years. What is the probability that somebody will successfully exploit this vulnerability against the box? And that is a probability of successful exploitation, which I think is a nuanced but fundamentally different approach to prioritization than any of the scan vendors are doing today. I think they've caught up with us in looking at, is an exploit here, will an exploit come out? I can't comment on how predictive or what the machine learning methods look like for doing that, but I don't think anybody's going to that next step and saying, here's the probability of it actually being used in an attack. This is an actual risk where we think somebody's been popped on.
Michael, you I believe, used the phrase NLP modeling. What is that?
Natural language
True.
processing.
Parentheses around that.
Yeah.
Natural language processing. So we'll look at all that text. Actually, I love this because if you think about what CVSS is, you've got 6 variables in CVSS 2 base.
Mm-hmm.
You've got 10, and if you do temporal, an analyst is sitting there reading a document, filling out a bunch of categorical variables about that. Is the access local or network?
Mm-hmm.
Is the authentication required or is it partial? Is the access complexity low or high? Those are judgment calls that a human is making based on reading a document, which is all that a vulnerability is. A pen test is the same thing as the CVE, except it's assigned to a particular software vendor and has a number assigned to it by NVD. So what we do is we have a machine read that same document and as much text as we can grab, and instead of making 6 categorical judgment calls, make 250 of them.
That's awesome. Is there a difficulty of the remediation that factors into any of your models? Because what I typically advise people, I'm like, look, like the severity is the severity, but if it's really easy to fix and the severity is high of it, however you classify it, like just fix it, right? Does that play into the model?
That's an excellent question. I think, well, I'm going to answer this in a wacky data sciencey way, which is I think
Go ahead. Have fun.
We buckled up. Go.
the outcome measured data is how often it's being popped elsewhere. So if the sensor networks are picking up a lot of it today, then that means it hasn't been fixed yet. And over time, that number should decrease if it's really easy to fix.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a walk around wishy-washy answer. I'm going to kick it over to Jason to talk about how we do top fixes. And then we have plans to do benchmarking on a vulnerability level where I think that difficulty will come in much more concretely and tangibly.
But I like that. If you can measure, like, no one's really applying this patch, that means it's probably a pain in the ass to install, right? I think we can...
Especially if you're talking about vulnerabilities that people are exploiting.
Yeah.
If it was easy, people would have patched it, so the
Right.
data would say it's going down, so we would prioritize it lower.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of a cop-out. I think that's just saying we have great data. That's not saying we're including.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, the as Michael said, our job is to put the right priorities in front of the teams to try to give as much context as we can. I think this question of what's difficult to patch is a really hard one. It's a really hard one to answer from a data model basis, and you have to understand what is a failure inside a specific company versus another.
Mm-hmm.
Patching Java here might be fine, and for one customer, patching Java somewhere else could break something. It's a very nuanced question that probably, to really solve, gets you into things like software composition analysis and how you kind of link and say, is this patch going to hit this? And like that assessment of potential impact is, I think, where people get really jammed up and have a hard time. And in the previous regime, when you were dealing with such a volume of patches, I think that's a big part of what slowed this whole process down, is you were trying to assess 100, 200, 1,000 different things. And just struggling to get to that answer. I think it's something we want to look at, kind of per Michael's point before, of kind of how we might see it from our data, but also, are there other sources of data we could go take on and apply? We see more and more we get into the IT side of the house. I mean, in our bigger customers, over around half our users are actually IT administrators. And I think this is another differentiator for us from some of the scanners. Like we don't see ourselves as a security only tool. Right, we really don't. We have a lot of IT users who have access to Kenna, get a dashboard with their systems, can look and see the vulnerabilities, can see the scores themselves, and can really self-serve what they need to go patch. And that what that ends up doing for our customers who have kind of achieved it is it gets security out of this game, as they're always telling IT what to do. IT is able to kind of make decisions and do it themselves. They're all aligned against the same goal of reducing risk and getting to an acceptable risk score. And that kind of changes this entire relationship, right? It changes it from an adversarial one to one where you're actually on the same team. Security's out of the day-to-day. And in the best case, you eliminate that weekly awful patch meeting, 20 people and multiple hours fighting about what to patch, what not to patch. And then security's really focused on reporting, right? And that's where our customers have seen the most value, is they just change the way this whole operation happens.
And Jason, I love that. I've spoken on previous shows how I love this progression of security's role being less operational, right? And that's exactly what you were just capturing. And where I see security's role, especially in the context of this conversation, is providing that threat modeling, right? Providing those inputs to your software that are the basis for the decisions on what's a priority. Security going, well, actually the compensating control here, as we just found in some of our lab testing, is weaker than we thought before. So IT go update that and then just work off the data that naturally comes off of that, and let the IT group be what they're good at, is operations, right? Let security be what we're good at, and that is the threat modeling and testing our compensating controls and things like that.
No, 100%. I think it even goes further. I think one of the things that was an early learning for me in the security industry, which was surprising, is the CISO's role is not necessarily to guarantee zero breaches. Not only is that impossible, it's just not what they set out to do. In large part, the CISO is there to achieve acceptable risk.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So how do you define and set acceptable risk, and then how do you prove that as an organization you're holding to it? And so I think that security org, as you said, model the threat, figure out what the risk actually is, work with the company to decide, are we good with a risk score of 500? Are we good with a risk score of 300? What is that score? Mm-hmm. And then how good, how happy are we to have a extraordinarily high risk vulnerability in our environment? Is that 2 days, 5 days, 10 days, 15 days? Kind of what's our risk tolerance? How we would respond to risk, right? And so I think they need to set that stuff, put the information into a tool like Kenna that allows you to then communicate that effectively to the IT teams. And as you say, the IT teams just consume it and operate.
Right.
And in the best world, this process to me it's such a big irritant for so many companies. I think it's easy to overlook it. But I think in terms of that IT security relationship, like this is one of the worst places, if you will, where the incentives are so at odds in a traditional market where security and IT are just running right into each other and fighting every single week. And so for the organizations where you've removed that, right, where you have let security focus on the security problem and it's actually communicated through a tool to the IT teams, I tell you, they tell us it's transformative. Like that's their word for what it's done for the organization. And that's a big part of why I was excited to join Kenna when I came across. And it's been a ton of fun so far.
And so what I love about that too, sorry, Matt, is that security benefits from that dynamic as well. Like management, IT are going, like you said, Jason, we're going to live with this risks for this amount of time, and security is at the table for that, hopefully, right? And they go, okay, we get that, right? But we want more visibility, better monitoring in this particular area, right? So security can make better decisions about where they're spending their time, specifically in monitoring and visibility.
Yeah, 100%. And you can respond and you handle exceptions. So if you say, look, we all agree to handle the high risk stuff first, and we agree to the measure, and IT every time they see something says, I know why this is high risk. I see it's been exploited. It's in common malware. I have evidence to support why I go after it. Occasionally I can't patch something. To your point, sometimes it's difficult. I had a test. I got to go through cycles. We get great. Well, then I know I've got this exposure. I can kind of accept it or extend my SLA. But man, I better do something on a compensated control basis, based on risk, and kind of manage that through the time period until I can actually get it patched. Conversely, the nice thing is you get to kind of push a bunch of stuff out and say, look, it's fine to wait for that. The next new vulnerability comes out. You say, is that a big deal? We look at Kenna. We look at the score. We look at the data we've given. I said, no, actually, it turns out that's a pretty low risk. You can wait until the next patch roll up. You don't have to go chase deploying this aggressively across your environment and potentially breaking things. Right?
What I love about this approach, we just talked about DevSecOps, integrating security into the DevOps pipeline. What they're doing is solving the old the IT SecOps problem, right? This integration of security with the IT operations folks to get to that same level of removing friction, allowing the teams to do what they do best, and providing them the valid information they need to take action, and allowing IT to do its job effectively. Same thing we're trying to do in DevSecOps. I mean, this is just taking a similar approach from this integration perspective in solving the age-old IT ops problem.
Yeah, 100%. And it's like, don't underestimate the amount of time and energy wasted. As I joke with this patch management process, you waste so much time deciding what to do. Like people ask us all the time, are you going to automation? Are you guys going to go do all this stuff to make patches automatic? I'm like, guys, I mean, I can get a little bit of a gain. Maybe it's a 5%, 10% gain, I don't know, in terms of automating patches. But the overwhelming time loss is the fight about deciding what to do. It's not doing the work. It's deciding which of that work you actually execute. And that's where we're really focused on kind of punching through and making that simple, getting everybody to the same list. We all agree. We all understand what we're doing. We're on a shared goal, shared goalposts. And by the way, because we prioritize, because of the data, as Michael kind of highlighted, we know it's only 2 to 5% of the actual vulnerabilities you have to patch. So by definition, I'm going to be asking you to patch probably an order of magnitude less stuff than I was yesterday, which is huge, right? That's not a small gain to the company. And by the way, security spends zero time coming up with that list, which is giving you cycles of security analysts, smart people who can go challenge, the rest of the security challenges you have, the labor shortage everybody's facing in security. You're getting time back for security, and then IT less risk, and IT is getting time back, right? Which is why, the customers who really get this, like this is a benefit that goes all the way up to the CIO, right? This is not a security analyst benefit. This is benefit to the CISO, it's to the CIO, kind of in comparison and kind of working together. Right?
It also gives you good metrics to take back up to the board, to report back up to the executive staff, so that you can really measure how the program's doing, where you are, where your risk tolerances are. It's a better way to track metrics than just number of critical vulnerabilities or number of vulnerabilities or number of incidents. All the things we know don't really resonate at the board or the executive level.
100%. You can talk about risk, and then you can talk about kind of, again, your one of the things we're really evolving is this concept of what is your risk tolerance? What should that imply in terms of things like SLAs and how you should be responding to risk? And then you start saying, how am I doing in performing against risk? A security organization doesn't control risk. They don't choose the software. They don't choose the bugs that somebody writes in their new application. The only thing that an organization can actually manage and control is both what is our desired posture and then what is our response to the risk that comes into the system. And so then that's the reporting you start looking at, is how am I doing in terms of risk? How am I doing in terms of responding to risk? And how am I within the risk tolerance that we set? And that provides a great conversation both for, if I need more budget, I can really justify why that's the case. If I feel like, hey, I'm doing right and we can go spend time elsewhere, I can also explain that. 100% really, really critical visibility up to management and obviously to the board.
I have a real quick sort of semi-hypothetical question. Hopefully you can cover fairly quickly. I was looking at your website and you've talked about how pen testing reports are one of the feeds that you take into your product or into your platform. If a pen test is done right, one of the goals of a pen test is that it threads together those low-level risks and vulnerabilities, low-level vulnerabilities that you don't necessarily have to address. And if a pen tester is successful in threading together some number of low-level vulnerabilities to be able to exploit and compromise, I assume you guys are able to accommodate that somehow or address that somehow in rescoring things based on the pen test report?
If a pen test comes through and essentially is evidence of exploit where we wouldn't have seen it before, how do we factor that in? Is that the right way to think about it?
Excellent.
Yes. Yeah, that's what he's asking.
That's what I'm asking, yes.
Yes.
Gotcha. It's a good one for Michael in terms of systematically how we handle it. As he called out, like certainly one of the things you can do inside the system is manually adjust scores. So in the case if somebody really got through and did something, I think we would, the easiest thing was just to adjust the scores directly in the system and respond to it. I'll let Michael maybe talk to how we, kind of how we think about that. And I'm not aware of cases where it's occurred in my own experience.
So I said it was hypothetical.
It's hypothetical, but I think it actually calls out something about the evolution of pen testing in general. It used to be, here's a PDF, I got in this way. But if you really break that down, those documents are collections of either weakness enumerations or existing CVEs that folks are using in conjunction with maybe misconfigurations that show a path that is truly risky. Right. So when we take uploads of pen tests, we say we need to see the weakness enumeration so we can assign that to an asset and have it be either distinct or correlated with a dynamic or static finding. Now, that's a lot of the way that people use pen tests at enterprises in general. It's they'll take a look at that PDF and say, okay, Veracode found this. If we remediate this vulnerability and Veracode closed it out, this path is no longer possible. Scaling it becomes more difficult, of course, but I think programmatically using something like an API and hitting every asset that has a similar configuration, you could say, here's a newly discovered path or tranche of vulnerabilities, some of which are described by our application security testing, some of which are existing CVEs, and we know that they have been used. So as a result, they are riskier. In fact, when we think about application security, we think if somebody found it via HackerOne or BugCrowd, it's probably more risky than just a static finding, probably more risky than just a dynamic. And the reason is that there's a built-in confidence in that finding actually being usable.
Cool.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Jason and Michael, thank you very much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Hey guys, appreciate it. Thanks. Glad we could get on here at short notice, and love it. Look forward to talking again soon.
Thank you. With that, we will conclude this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly and essentially see you next year. So thanks everyone for listening and watching.